Today's Imprint Weekly podcast is brought to you by Accenture. Change is afoot in child welfare. Change that means agencies focus on results for children and keep far more of them safe at home with their own families. Accenture's child welfare team is leading the way in the effort to ensure technology does its part in that success story. Accenture offers cutting-edge case management tools that ensure agencies can see insights that drive decision-making and caseworkers have information they need at their fingertips. Together, these tools help agencies stay laser-focused, reinventing child welfare into a source of strength for families when they need it. For more information, visit www.accenture.com/childwelfare.
Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters, and for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. We're rolling with no guest today, so this will be a relatively quick episode. I am going to run through some recent headlines in a few minutes, but before that, I wanted to take a little time out to talk about something very exciting that we will be soon launching here at Fostering Media Connections. So this month, I don't want to say a day yet and jinx it, FMC is launching SafeCamp Audio, which is going to be a podcast network featuring great shows focused on child welfare, youth justice, and the many issues that relate to those two main focal points. And the website, the entire platform, all the social media handles for that network will be coming soon. I'll make another announcement on this podcast when that happens. I will also include in the show notes for this episode a link to a very simple kind of mailing list form. So if you want to get some information about the forthcoming network, you can sign up. You just got to give us a name and an email address, and we'll add you to the list. But let me just tell you a little bit of our thinking behind building the SafeCamp Audio Network. Obviously, we have been producing this podcast, the Imprint Weekly Podcast, for a few years now. We're up to whatever this is, episode 129. But it's always been our belief at Fostering Media Connections that we could serve as really just a strong hub to help lift up not only things that we work on in the audio space, but really all the great stuff that's already out there that, we generally feel probably doesn't get as many eyeballs and ears as it really should, because there's just simply not this kind of central connective network geared towards making sure that people know what's out there. So, this is definitely going to be a significant learning curve for us. We're going to start pretty modestly here as we kind of learn what it takes to build a podcast network and platform. Certainly, we have designs on doing more in the audio space ourselves, whether that's through, investigative or enterprise, journalism projects through the Imprint, which is our daily news site. I definitely see a future for podcasts, both in our Youth Voices Rising program and Fostering Families Today. But we also want it to be core to this network, SafeCamp Audio. I'm going to say it a million times to promote the name and get that brand going. It's really core to this mission for us that it's not just about what we want to do in podcast world. There are people doing amazing things right now related to child welfare. I will say, my hope is that we as a hub can attract more people with an interest in doing stuff around youth justice, because I do think there's very little discussion in the podcast realm about that issue. But certainly already there's some really great people doing great shows, and we're proud to be starting this out and working with a few of them. Let me actually just call out a few of these podcasts. This is not an exhaustive list, but here's a few of the sort of inaugural members of this network. We have the Audio Nuggets podcast, which is hosted by Corey Best, who is the founder of Mining for Gold. How Is That Legal?, which is a really great podcast now in its second season, coming out of the Community Legal Services of Philadelphia. It's hosted by Key Tobar. They break down, specific examples of systemic racism in the law and policy in each episode. We have the Children's Law podcast. This is one of the first podcasts kind of in this space that I ever heard. This is Angela Orkin, Jim and John Walsh. The Walshes set up, what's largely considered to be one of the best Children's Legal Counsel's operations in Palm Beach, Florida. And they're all veterans that representing kids in child welfare proceedings. It's a really great show. Epic, which is the podcast hosted by the Parental Rights Foundation. So pretty much a weekly program, features really just, they've had terrific guests. They're really great interviewers and touch on all kinds of parental rights issues swinging across the political spectrum. We have several podcasts from young people who have recently experienced the foster care system that are all incredibly powerful in their own way, unbelievably resilient. I've said this on this podcast before. I think it's probably the best podcast in terms of just being excellently produced, great topics, really just crisp, clean shows. They kind of feature storytelling and shared experiences, seeking to inspire youth with similar backgrounds, to know that they're not defined by their experiences. And their season 3 just came out. I would highly recommend all of them, but in particular, the first 2 episodes were just bangers. Resilient Voices and Beyond is another podcast hosted by Michael Davis Thomas, a young man I had the fortune of meeting recently. I live in Detroit. He lives just down the way in Southfield, Michigan, and he has just been prolific in producing podcasts in which he interviews guests ranging from other youth who've experienced the system to professionals, either in Michigan or elsewhere that he's come across, and he has really great conversations on there. And then finally, Ivory Bennett, whose eponymous show, Ivory Bennett, the podcast, which I love the name, just debuted. She had a really powerful conversation about sexual assault in the first episode. Ivory is somebody that Fostering Media Connections has worked with quite a bit. She helped us put together a higher ed guide for our Fostering Families Today readers, which was truly amazing. She did just a bang-up job on that, and we had her on the podcast to talk about her own experiences with higher education. So I'll drop a link to that interview in the show notes for this episode. So that's not an exhaustive list. We have some other inaugural members lined up. I expect we'll pick up a few others along the way here in year 1. But what you can expect from SafeCamp Audio is that we're going to start in this first year by really trying to prove that kind of proof of concept that just starting a hub that exists really for the purpose of promoting, lifting up, helping to distribute, and just raise the profile of people who are already doing a very good job in this space will increase the number of people that know about these shows and listen to these shows. But also, I'm hoping will get people off the sidelines who might have an idea for a really good audio project in this space, whether that's youth justice or child welfare or something related, and get out there and do it. Maybe the, knowledge that there is somebody that exists as a hub who might partner with you to kind of help get the word out about stuff can get some more people involved. And then, certainly as we get our feet under us, you can certainly expect more podcast concepts and projects coming out of Fostering Media Connections in all of our programs as well. So SafeCamp Audio coming soon. We got all the social media stuff lined up. It's just SafeCamp Audio wherever you go, Twitter, Facebook, all that stuff. And again, I will put just the easy form you can fill out to just get added to it'll be a light touch newsletter, just letting people know about different episodes. You can sign up to get information in that way. SafeCamp Audio coming soon. All right, so we will take a quick break and then we'll come back and run through some headlines for the week.
For 2 decades, Fostering Families Today magazine has educated families raising and supporting children and youth in foster care. Delivered in print or online 6 times each year, Fostering Families Today gives families the latest tips, strategies, and research on caring for children with traumatic backgrounds. Use promo code PODCAST5 to save $5 on a print or digital subscription today. Just go to fosteringfamiliestoday.com/subscribe and enter PODCAST5 to save $5 on your subscription. That's fosteringfamiliestoday.com/subscribe.
All right, let's go through some headlines for the week, and I'm going to start with the bipartisan bill that was introduced in Congress last week called the Stop Institutional Child Abuse Act, which I think can reasonably be viewed as a very small baby step towards what could end up being more serious regulation of residential care facilities for kids by the federal government at some point. So this bill itself has had different titles in the past. I think it got this title, Stop Institutional Child Abuse Act, last year. I'm not even sure it ever got actually formally introduced last year. But, what it does is basically study the problem. At this point, creates, a group to do that, a study group, and seeds kind of two purposes. First is making recommendations around the creation of a federal database that would be capable of tracking process and outcomes data, things like length of stay, incidents of restraint, how after care is handled for youth coming out of a group home situation or residential. And then the other sort of task would be, a biennial slate of recommendations around best practices, both within residential, so promising practices and how to safely and effectively run residential programs and for youth, both in child welfare and on probation, as well as, on the private side too, because there are certainly thousands of youth who are sent to residential care, not as a result of interactions with the government, but at the behest of their parents. And then also to kind of lift up evidence-based and promising practices around community alternatives to the use of residential care. If you needed to, a case to be made that such recommendations or a group to build some sort of idea for a database in this area, actually matters, I would listen to our last two guests on this program, the Imprint Weekly podcast, who were both talking about the last, quasi-regulation of congregate care from the feds, and that came through the Family First Act, one of the big provisions of the Family First Act, and obviously this mostly relates to child welfare and youth and foster care, was to limit the amount of time that, any system could draw down federal dollars to help pay for congregate care to 2 weeks, with these pretty enormous exceptions. And one of those exceptions was qualified residential treatment programs, which is, delineated in law as something that would be, designed to serve a more acute need medically or mental health wise for a young person than, say, your typical group home might or another residential care program. And listening to the interviews that we did with Carrie Richmond, who oversaw, a national survey and focus group session around implementation of those regulations. I wouldn't know if I would call them regulations, except that the qualified residential treatment program was a newly created kind of description of acute need congregate care. So I guess in that sense, it is regulating a group of providers who could get money on a more continuous basis than others. So I guess that is regulation. So Carrie talked about that on the national scale. Jim Zarniak did kind of deep dive on what's going on in just one state in New York around this. And, I think that the reason that ties into the bill being talked about or introduced on Capitol Hill last week is there was this one term or concept that really jumped out from both the national work that Carrie was working on and the New York work that Jim was working on, and as the concept of rubber stamping. In the focus groups with youth who had recently experienced congregate care placement, young people voiced in those focus groups that there really wasn't much they could articulate as different about these placements between the time when they became QRTPs, Qualified Residential Treatment Programs, and before. And Jim's report flags, multiple times the concern around rubber stamping, in that so many of New York's residential care providers, I think he cited 154, had already become accredited as QRTPs, as Qualified Residential Treatment Programs, and that a very tiny percentage of attempts to get a child into a QRTP and keep them there were overruled or overridden by a judge. All to him, rose to the level of kind of calling that out and calling out the, potential for rubber stamping. And this was a concern of people who had a wariness that the way that Family First was set up was going to successfully do anything to change, the use of congregate care, was that it created a whole bunch of exceptions to this limit of 2 weeks. That was kind of the lead of the law as far as the congregate care, was to say after 2 weeks you're cut off, but here are a couple of exceptions to that rule that would allow you to draw down federal money for much longer to help pay for residential care. One of those is the QRTP. Another is pregnant parenting teen youth who are 18 or over, so are in extended foster care, or then youth who are at potential risk of being sex trafficked. And we talked to Robin Rosenberg a few months ago about the fact that Florida seems to be kind of using that exception almost as a rule. So the fear was those four taken together or, individually really could just become exceptions that eat the rule. And a lot of whether or not any of this succeed would really lie with whether judges were willing to scrutinize, arguments made to keep kids in these QRTPs for a very long time. What Jim surfaces is that, at least in this early going, there is very little pushback when systems are trying to keep young people in residential care for, months on end. So as always, I will leave our story on the new bill, the Stop Institutional Child Abuse Act, in the show notes for anybody who wants to read that. Mississippi was at the heart of the decision that ended up leading to the overturning of Roe v. Wade, the Dobbs decision. And recently, their governor, Tate Reeves, held a signing ceremony for a suite of legislation that he, describes as being part of a response, essentially, to the overturning of Roe. I'm going to read from his quote during the signing ceremony. Mississippi has moved to the next phase in our pursuit to build a culture of life. That phase is the new pro-life agenda. This next phase will not be easy and it will not be free, but it is the right thing to do. And I should add that, the reporting on this coming out of AP News cites that in Mississippi, I'm not entirely certain who, because it's not specified in the story, but, analysts expect that as a result of the overturning of Roe v. Wade, the state will experience 5,000 more births per year sometime soon. So what is this, series of legislation around the culture of life includes a $10,000 adoption tax credit for adopting youth in state. It includes $5,000 credits for adopting youth out of state. It includes protection or support for safe haven sites. That's these places where you can kind of, in a judgment-free fashion, leave a child to be, taken in by law enforcement to be kept safe and then, placed with somebody who was willing to adopt them. And then there is essentially a bill that is a foster parents' bill of rights that provides more transparency and seems to give more, it gives more transparency and increases to some extent the access that foster parents have to proceedings around a child that they are caring for. And so I just want to call this out because I did the same thing when Tennessee introduced a bunch of legislation on this. There might be it may be rational to look at the fact that there'd be 5,000 more births per year coming in the state and assume that, there would be an increase in the number of children for whom adoption, but I would say private adoptions, will become and would be of increased interest. I don't know that means that adoption needs to be incentivized, certainly of newborns. If that's where the adoption tax credits kind of align with this in Governor Reeves' mind and the legislator's mind. The insertion of foster care, I will just, again, sorry to be on the soapbox, say that it's particularly gross to assume and anticipate that the increase in the number of children who are being born, that 5,000 more, would necessitate some outsized change in foster care, or that is where you would want to align the assistance you are going to give to Mississippians is around adoption and foster care. What you would know most assuredly from, the information that there were expected to be 5,000 more births per year in the state as a result of the option of abortion being foreclosed to parents, is that there will be a lot more parents born to low-income mothers who made that decision or would have made that decision, based on the fact that they weren't financially prepared or ready to be a parent. Why there'd be a slate of pro-life agenda legislation that didn't include, substantive ways to improve their lives seems just off. For example, the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, which replaced welfare in 1996, it can be used by states to give direct monthly, cash support to low-income parents. There are about 200 parents currently receiving TANF payments from the federal government. Most of TANF in Mississippi is used for other things, including to backstop foster care and child welfare. So it just seems, not to editorialize way too much here, but this is another example of a state where the preparation for a post-Roe world seems to revolve entirely around anticipating that parents who are reluctantly becoming parents won't be good parents or give their children up for adoption, which very fair could happen in some cases, will happen in some cases. But again, going back to the kind of root assumption, what will happen if 5,000 more children are born in Mississippi? You'd think you would just start by supporting the birth parents. Let's do a little research talk. 2 studies of late have come out that examine the racial disparity involved in various points along the child welfare continuum, from child protection reports to termination of parental rights. I'll link to both of these studies, or at least where you can get a summary of them, in our show notes. The first is a look at state-level variation in the cumulative prevalence of child welfare system context. So the cumulative risk of children experiencing various points along the line, broken out into investigations, removals, and terminations of parental rights. It's a really great reference for anybody who wants to kind of have this view along state lines and then also along demographic breakdown lines on all these points, because it's all in chart form here, along with a few comparative density maps in there to help visualize things as well. 2 big things to note off of this one. First, it's just how wide the variation is in terms of cumulative risk from state to state. I guess it's somewhat regionally compartmentalized on this stuff, but it's very, apparent when you look at the different state-by-state charts that they have here and graphs, just how wide the delta is between one state and another, seemingly with no real reason. Just a few examples. So risk of confirmed maltreatment ranged from 3% in Pennsylvania to 27% in Kentucky. Those states are not very far away. In one state, there's a 3% chance, 3% of kids are going to experience a confirmation of maltreatment. In another one, it's 27% of kids. A child's risk of seeing their parents' rights terminated is not even visible as a percent in Maryland. It's under 1%, to the point that it shows up as 0.00. Just a short drive down the highway in West Virginia, that is 8%. So 8% of kids are going to experience their parental rights being terminated. They also do some interesting stuff with risk ratio comparisons. So they're comparing, the risk of one thing to another in terms of cumulative risk. So, and those provide some pretty wide variations as well. Just here's one example, just to try to bring this to life. There's a chart showing the risk ratio comparison between confirmed maltreatment to investigations, which I guess in a way is trying to get at, how divergent is the risk involved in being investigated to the experience of, or likely experience of, having maltreatment confirmed. Same deal, very wide variation in North Carolina. The risk ratio for, comparing confirmed maltreatment to investigations is 0.13 in North Carolina. That's very low. That means there's a very large divide between, the risk of being investigated and the risk of actually experiencing a confirmation of maltreatment. And then in Utah, on the other end, it's 0.55. So it's a very high, or that is the highest of the 50 states, correlation or connection between the experience or risk of being investigated and the risk of confirmed maltreatment. I didn't mean to say correlation there because I don't want to get into words that have a charged meaning there. This study also finds that, and I'm just going to quote from them here, racial disparities in child welfare contact were not linear with progression through the system, and disparities in confirmed maltreatment and foster care placement, or either of those experiences and termination of parental rights, cannot be interpreted as being driven exclusively by differences in risks of experiencing earlier stage child welfare events. This is a very wordy, steady way of saying that their data did not show that everything in terms of inequity or disparity is explained by a similar disparity or a larger one at a point earlier in the system. The second study that just came out is entitled Racial and Ethnic Differences in Child Protective Services Reporting, Substantiation, and Placement with Comparison to Non-CPS Risks and Outcomes. Long titles on both of these. This work attempts to contextualize the racial disparities in child welfare reports against what the report describes as, and their words, other indicators of social risk, namely what they tease out: single-parent households, households without a high school graduate, poverty rates, and teen birth rates. The study then compares substantiation and foster care placement rates across race. So this is all done using data for white, Black, and Hispanic youth. On the first point about the CPS reports compared or contextualized around other indicators of social risk, what's visible in the data and the charts in this, that the CPS reports for Black youth, there certainly is a risk disparity ratio that's higher than 1. It's closer to 2 between Black and white youth. But that risk disparity ratio is significantly lower than the risk ratio when you compare white and Black children on those other factors like poverty and teen birth rates, etc. And then in comparing the substantiation and foster care placement rates between the years 2005 and 2019, the study finds that prior to 2012, Black children were more likely to see an investigation substantiated for maltreatment and also more likely to experience a higher rate of placement in foster care. But in more recent years, that's flipped and it's actually slightly lower now. So Black children have a lower substantiation rate, a lower placement rate into foster care. So on that point about substantiation of foster care placements, the authors conclude in here, I'm going to quote from them here: "We do not doubt that instances of racism are present in all large systems. Our data, however, do not show clear evidence of accumulating anti-Black outcomes in the form of increased substantiation and removal in the CPS system." And that's part and parcel of sort of where the authors take their implication section or the discussion session, in which they devote a lot of that to pushing back against the abolition movement, the idea of abolishing the child welfare system as it currently operates in America. So I'll read out part of that kind of captures their view here. "Proponents of abolishing the system routinely cite racial disparities in reporting and subsequent decision-making as justification for their policy preferences, arguing that Black children's contact with CPS is grossly in excess of their exposure to risk or harm. In this current analysis, we find that the racial disparities in CPS contact do not exceed and are generally smaller than racial disparities in external measures of social risk and harm." All right, and the last bit of data news on the old research front, just mentioning that the nonprofit Child Trends has released their updated state-level data for understanding child welfare in the United States, which is a very highly searchable state-by-state database. It's basically a must bookmark if you are interested in kind of having a good, solid reference for child welfare data. I haven't had time to play around with it myself with the update yet, but the 5 main categories we can get all of this stuff broken down by state, which really is the highest level at which child welfare exists in America, other than, the unaccompanied minors program that serves youth who are arriving from other countries. So the 5 main categories on the site are maltreatment, foster care, kinship caregiving, permanency, and older foster youth. Just an aside, was relatively recently talking with a pretty notable researcher on child welfare, and this list of topics made me think about that conversation because it was about, I was talking to this person about how little we know about the assignment of non-foster care interventions by area or state or race or anything. And that shows up here, which is not a knock in any way on Child Trends. They cannot do their usual great work of displaying things that are usable for data that just doesn't exist. So you go from maltreatment right to foster care and kinship care and permanency without, anything about, intervention or prevention services, because that is just simply not collected in any sort of codified way across the country. We talked a few months ago on the podcast to Ian Forber-Pratt of Siri about the situation in Ukraine a year after the war. And he discussed mostly what he knows about, which is, two things: the effort in Ukraine to protect the orphans that were already in the Ukraine living in orphanages. It uses orphanages at a higher rate than most, pretty much any country in the world, or one of them, certainly in Europe. So, we talked about the efforts to keep kids safe in those orphanages, many of whom have very serious physical or medical disabilities and are essentially stuck in these places like they are still in the country as these battles are raging. And then he talked also about the toll of family separation and family stability for those who had left the country with their children, often while the men in their lives continued to stay and fight, went to these different countries. And, as is sadly the case in any, sort of mass refugee situation, the goodwill that starts withers or gets winnowed down over the years. Anyway, this is sort of a coda to that. The New York Times this month produced some alarming reporting that Russian troops are essentially apprehending adolescents who end up remaining in the country of Ukraine and relocating them to schools and centers inside either Russian-occupied Ukraine or actually in some cases all the way back to Russia itself. So, and I'm quoting from the New York Times here: once under Russian control, the children are subject to re-education, fostering, and adoption by Russian families, practices that have touched a particular nerve, even amid the carnage that has killed and displaced so many Ukrainians. This is a very serious issue. It appears that, intentional family separation could be happening within the country in a way that's scarily could lead to just erasure, on some level. And that's why, this played out or moved into international court. An arrest warrant was issued last month by the International Criminal Court accusing Putin and his Children's Rights Commissioner of illegally transferring youth. So certainly something I wanted to kind of follow up, since that was not part of our discussion with Ian. It certainly was alarming to learn about. And last but not least for this week, we have had Sixto Cancel on this podcast before to talk about the work that the organization he founded, Think of Us, is doing around the country, particularly in the creation of its Center for Lived Experience. Well, that organization just received a massive investment from the Audacious project, which is probably best known for producing the TED Talks series that is so popular online. $47.5 million going to Think of Us for the Center for Lived Experience and for other projects. Cancel also recorded his own TED Talk, which focuses on the importance of prioritizing kinship care in the child welfare system, and that should be released, I am told, this month. So congratulations to Think of Us. That's a very sizable investment, game-changing money for any organization. All right, that's going to do it for today. Thanks to absolutely nobody for joining us today. Just kidding. We'll have some great guests coming up. It was good to get a few headlines out and promote SafeCamp Audio, which again, coming soon. Check out SafeCamp Audio, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. Website will be up soon. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of Fostering Media Connections, a California-based nonprofit that publishes the Imprint Fostering Families Today and operates the Youth Voices Rising program. It also operates the SafeCamp Audio Podcast Network, coming soon. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Anjoko, with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you'd consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we would greatly appreciate if you'd consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it is super easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. And you can always get us over email at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.